When we're looking to change the tone of a sound, the first thing that we're gonna look to grab is an EQ, right? Or an equalizer. And these days there are so many options out there that it can be a bit overwhelming for the average bedroom producer. And so today what we're gonna do is take a look at which types of EQs are gonna be essential in your workflow and which ones could you probably do without until much later down the line. Let's jump in. So there's 4 factors that I'm considering here with these different types of EQs. The first one is cost, the second is versatility, the third one is going to be processing power required, and the fourth is ease of use. And that will help us determine which of these are going to be essential for your production workflow. The first type of EQ that we're going to consider is the graphic EQ, which I put as one of the most basic EQs out there. You might see this more often in live environments than you will in a digital production environment, but they still have their uses. Now this is Voxengo Marvel Graphic EQ, and you might recognize Voxengo from other videos that I've done because I also have this Voxengo Span plugin that I've used a lot. And it's just gonna help us keep track of what's going on in the frequency spectrum as we go along here. So to demonstrate what's happening with each of these EQs, I made just a little noisy synth patch that sounds like this. The reason it's more on the noisy side is so that we can more easily tell what we're doing with the EQ with a wider frequency response source, right? So yeah, if you want to go through and adjust each of these bands, you can see that they're fairly narrow. Now, in my opinion, I think that this is one of the types of EQs that most people could go without because it's simply not that versatile. You know, it does cover the frequency spectrum, but I think that for most people, you would want to have control over each of, where the frequency band is centered on that you want to control here. Another thing we don't have control over is the width of the frequency band. So in order to work around that, you have to actually use multiple sliders to help you create the curve that you're after. So if you wanted to create like a shelf type curve, which is where you control everything above or below a certain frequency that you set. So let's say we wanted to reduce everything above 3K. We'd have to go through here and get the same value for every single one, which is not ideal, right? So this is a really nice, easy to use EQ, but it's not great for the flexibility and the control that we'd like to have over the tone of most sounds. But if you're just a beginner and you're just getting into EQ, this might be a good place to start. So you can, start using your ears instead of relying on what you're seeing visually, which is going to be an important part of when you're EQing the tone of your sounds. The next type of EQ that we're going to look at is probably the most common EQ that you'll find in most DAWs and in most audio situations, and that's the parametric EQ. And I'm just using the EQ8 from Ableton, the stock DAW parametric EQ. So with the graphic EQ, we didn't have control over where the center of the band was, but here we can control that, which is much more intuitive. And we can start getting much more specific with how we want to control the sound. We can also control the width. Which is really nice. And we also have access to more than one type of filter. So instead of controlling a band like this, we can actually have a shelf, which we looked at earlier. So let's say we want to do the same thing. We wanted to increase the higher frequencies above 3K. We can just use a shelf filter like this, and we can go to 3K, and we can raise it all up at the same time, which is very, very useful on both ends of the spectrum. We also have access to low pass filters, which only let the frequencies through below the cutoff point. And we also have a high pass filter as well that we can use on any of these bands. So it's super, super versatile. It's easy to use, and it's free because it's going to come with most of your DAW. And so this is the one that I recommend for most people. There are a couple of downsides to working with a parametric EQ like this. One of them is that you can introduce some what's called phase distortion when you start adding in all these different filters, and it can mess with the phase alignment of different frequency bands within your signal depending on the types of curves that you're using. But there is a solution for that, which we'll get to down the line. The second downside, perhaps, for some people is that they can sound a bit stale. So when you're pulling up frequencies like this, it can almost sound a bit like too clean. And some other EQs have a little bit of magic where they add in some other harmonics and make it sound a little sweeter to our ears in different ways, which we will also get to in just a moment here. So those are the main downsides, but for most people, I think this is the best possible EQ that you could use and get familiar with. The next EQ that we're going to look at here is the semi-parametric EQ. And it's similar to a graphic EQ in that we also don't get to choose the frequency bands that we're working with. They're predetermined. But with these, and especially analog emulations of these semi-parametric EQs, you're going to get some very interesting tonal options available. Now, in my opinion, this is a bit more of a luxury than most bedroom producers would need compared to the parametric EQ, but it can be a good next step after you've kind of mastered the parametric EQ from your DAW. So let's actually put this on a drum loop so we can kind of hear what it starts to do here. Let's say we wanted to make a nice broad adjustment to somewhere around, let's go 3K. So we're at the 3K range here. We've got sort of a medium width of everything, and we're just going to start boosting. You can hear what it starts to do. Now let's pull open an EQ, a parametric EQ, and see if we can do that same thing and then compare how they sound. I'm gonna add a band here and we're gonna go to 3K and we're just gonna compare and see if it sounds similar. Okay, so let's go up 7 dB here. And then compare them. Can you hear a difference between those two? If you can, then you might want to consider a semi-parametric EQ. If you can't, then it might be best to stick with just the parametric EQ for now. One thing I really like about these EQs is that it forces you to use your ears instead of your eyes, and that can be a very valuable exercise. A lot of these analog EQs are quite imperfect, and they had these different frequency responses based on the internal components that a lot of engineers would get attached to, and there'd be a certain sound associated with the harmonics that EQ would be able to add or take away from whatever source material they're working with. The next type of EQ that I want to talk about is dynamic EQ, and this to me is an essential piece for every music producer because it offers something different to normal EQ, sort of a combination between compression and EQ, and it's super valuable in a lot of different scenarios. So say we had, a synth line like this in a song. And I know it sounds a little bit silly, but it's just to demonstrate that the frequency response is changing over time depending on the note that we're playing. And that's really important for EQ because as we make adjustments, we're making adjustments not just to one note, but to all the notes that are being played inside of your sound. So now if we we tighten up the Q factor, which is basically the width of the frequency band that we're working with, and we turn on threshold to make sure that we are activating the dynamic EQ portion here. Watch what happens. So it was only activating on certain notes when those notes corresponded with a higher output gain in that specific band, which is super, super useful. And you can even mix and match these. So, you have a dynamic EQ on this band, but on this one, it's not. So it's really, really versatile and something that I think everybody should have. The last style of EQ I want to talk to you about is what I would consider in general to be the bells and whistles EQ. So there are certain features that address some of the things that we have spoken about earlier. So if you remember me talking about the phase distortion, you can actually use an EQ that has a linear phase mode on it to help compensate for the phase discrepancies when you're actually mixing and matching lots of different filters and you have a certain EQ curve set. Now, this style of EQ is going to be much more technical and accurate than a standard DAW EQ. And so for that reason, you might not want to consider having it or using this mode unless you're working on a lot of mixing and mastering and making sure that those phase relationships are perfect, because it does require more processing and it is more expensive. Now, if you use something like FabFilter Pro Q3, this is a great EQ and a really nice parametric EQ upgrade because it's super versatile. So if I add a point here, and you can right click and you can change the shape to all of these, you can change the slope, and you can change the stereo placement and even split it into left and right, and you can even make it dynamic as well. And so it's a very versatile EQ. But what I want to point your attention to is at the bottom it says 0 latency. So right now this basic EQ is at 0 latency. It's going to be instant. But you can change the phase to natural or even linear phase so that everything, when you make all these changes with, you know, whatever EQ you set, you can change the quality of the linear phase amount, right? So let's say it's on maximum. So now when I play this, you can see that there's about a half a second of latency on there. And so it's obviously requiring a lot more processing power, which is not ideal for the music and production environment, but it is nice for maybe mixing and mastering. Another component that you might see in the bells and whistles category is called mid-side processing. Now this can be a useful feature. So if you have like a stereo signal like this with our drum loop, you have parts of the drum loop that are in the sides only and parts that are in the center only. And you can actually fold them down into each of those categories. So if we folded this down right into mid only, and I'm using a utility in Ableton to do this, these are the signals that are only in the left and right channels both. There are also signals that are in only the left or the right channel and not in both at the same time in the same way. So that's going to be what's called the difference. So mostly hi-hats here. And so a cool thing that you can do with this information is that if you have like FabFilter Pro Q3 or, well, many other EQ plugins do this as well, you can actually process the side differently from the mid signal. And so what this means is that I can brighten up the hi-hats in this drum loop without having access to the individual drum hits in the channels that make up this drum loop. So if we created like a shelf sound here and we changed the shape to be a high shelf and we raise this way up and we change the stereo placement to be side, now listen to what happens. And of course, you can do the same thing with just the stuff in the center. So it's just gonna be mostly the kick and snare, right? So you can hear those hi-hats are coming through, but not the highs inside of the kick and the snare. So there's lots of different scenarios where that might be useful, but I think for most people, it's definitely overkill for, you know, what you'd need on a regular basis. So my overall recommendation for most people is to stick with your DAW's stock parametric EQ, get really comfortable adjusting the tone of sounds how you see fit. And then also add in a dynamic EQ, and you can even use a free one like the TDR Nova that I used in this video to help you control signals without removing them altogether, which I think is an important distinction for you to make with your ears over time. And then after you get comfortable with those two, then move on to more advanced style EQs like the semi-parametric analog emulations, the linear phase processing, and the mid-side processing and all that. That stuff can wait until down the line. You don't necessarily need that stuff. So if you guys do have any questions or any tips and tricks of your own that you want to add into the mix to help out your fellow producers, let us know down in the comments below. And until next time, happy music making. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.